Hello, I'm Naomi Hossain. I'm a research professor at the Accountability Research Centre at American University and also a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the politics of education in developing countries. I'm talking a lot about a book. You can see the picture on the screen, the cover of the book, which is available, by the way, free for download. If you just Google it, you'll find it. And that book was published in 2019. It was edited by Sam Hickey, who's at Manchester University, and myself, and involved a very large number of contributors, chapter authors and commentators, including some quite famous names there. I just wanted you to know that there were lots of people involved in this book, not just me. This is the outline of what I'm going to be talking to you today about. I'm going to first talk a little bit about the politics of education and development, and in particular the issue of widening access. And then I'm going to talk about the politics of what we now think of as the learning crisis, the fact that children may be going to school but they're not necessarily learning very much. I'm going to tell you about the research questions that we took when that we asked when we were writing this book and the approach we took. I'll give you some of the findings at the national level, the subnational level, and at the community level, what actually happens in schools, how the politics of learning affects what happens in schools. And I'll finish with a bit of a discussion about the policy and research implications, and particularly the things I'm thinking about now, some years after we finished this book. The politics of education and development in many ways has been about widening access. And this is, it's kind of striking because you almost don't notice that there is a politics of widening access. And that's partly because all around the world after the end of colonialism, as countries were decolonizing and building new nations after the Second World War, you saw education systems expanding and children, more and more children attending basic education, attending primary school around the world. And there's many theories about how that happened and why that happened. There's a whole body of thought which is called world systems theory, which suggests that there's a tendency for all countries to converge around education access. Everyone in the world will need to be able to read and write in more or less the same sorts of ways. But there are also arguments that say that education widened, the access to education widened all around the world in response to demand from people, from citizens. They wanted their children to be educated because they wanted them to take certain kinds of jobs. They wanted them just to be educated, and government supplied education in response. There's also quite a lot of really interesting research on the formal politics and the informal politics and policy coalitions that help drive agendas like education for all and the Millennium Development Goals push for basic education. There's also quite a lot known about how transnational actors, aid actors, quite a lot is talked about how transnational actors like the World Bank, for instance, have influenced wider access to education, which has been the big story. And there I like to show this graph because I think it's ever so striking to see how children from low-income countries, that's the orange graph, or red, I'm not sure how it shows up on your screen, did begin to catch up, at least numerically, in terms of how many kids were going to school with the middle income and the richer countries. And so what you have now is a situation where almost all around the world, almost all kids have, at least in theory, access to school places at primary. It's really very striking. But what we do find is while more and more children are going to school, it's less clear that they're learning anything in those classrooms. So this graph from the Education for All Global Monitoring Report shows you that of the 650 million primary school children in the whole world, 250 million of them are not even really learning the basics of reading and writing, or the basics, mathematics. And that situation has just got worse because of COVID. More children have seen schools close for years in some cases. Online learning is not an option for many people in lots of countries. The digital divide is so great. In many places there's no electricity, so to even talk about online learning is a non-starter. So we do know that COVID has made the learning poverty worse than it was, and it's not likely to recover anytime soon the way things are going. So we did have some knowledge before we went and wrote this book about the politics of learning. But it should be said that there's comparatively little political science analysis or political sociology analysis of the learning crisis, of learning, of education in general, but of learning in particular. So we knew already, as I said, that there'd been a really fast convergence in enrollments around the world in the 2000s. But this did not mean that children were learning the same everywhere or learning at the same level. And we saw in many, many countries in the global south, many developing countries, levels of learning at home were really low, absolutely. You know, there are some countries in the world where even the very best performing students would be in remedial measures in a developing country because the overall standards of education are so low. And it's true that some of this is to do with poverty and the level of development, but when you look at actually what's going on inside countries, in some areas, in some communities, in some populations, children are learning very well, and in some they are not. And this unevenness tells you that it's not just about the level of poverty and the level of development. We often look at countries like Vietnam, which has had made really stellar progress on learning outcomes. It's not a very highly developed country, and it's not a very wealthy country either. And yet they have managed to do very well. If you look at a country like Nigeria, some parts of the country people are learning a lot, and in others they're learning much less. But it is also true that money does matter. If well-resourced classrooms are generally better classrooms, but it's not the only answer. There are also school systems where lots of money is spent and children still don't learn much. And what's kind of challenging, I think, in the policy, in the global education policy world, but also in the global education research world, is there is not that much agreement about what works to improve learning. There's lots of talk about teacher accountability, about effective schools, about pedagogy. There's all sorts of efforts to understand what works to improve learning, but it's quite hard to develop, if you like, strong political support for learning reforms compared to access reforms. When governments wanted to expand access, they found that relatively easy to do, and everyone knew really how that could be done. In the World Development Reports, these are the World Bank reports that they produce annually, there have been a couple of efforts to explain the learning crisis or to understand better the politics of learning. In 2004 they did a big report on accountability, which looked at how teachers and schools were held accountable for their performance or not. In 2018 they did another report, this time on education, and they noted that one of the real problems with the learning crisis, one of the real causes of it, was that policies were kind of misaligned. So what was happening in the capital city was policies were being made that didn't really play out as expected in the communities, in the schools themselves. And in all of these debates among global education policymakers and researchers, one thing did come to be agreed, which is that politics really matter. Politics matter for education outcomes, for learning attainments, but we don't know how. And this is why we wrote this book, really. This is why we did this research. And this research asked, centrally, how do political and political economy factors shape elite commitment to higher quality education? Our assumption here, a big assumption here, is that elite commitment is really what matters when it comes to delivering higher quality education. And so this research, and there were 6 country case studies, I'll tell you a bit more about those, we tested assumptions that political settlements where elites have shorter time horizons are less likely to try to redistribute power in the education system than political settlements where elites are better insulated and can think longer term. What this really means is that we think that elites who have a lot of control over political power can probably have the luxury of taking difficult decisions to make education systems more effective, to make learning more likely, than those countries where political elites are worried about losing the next election and have to try and keep teachers and others happy. So this research also explored how different political settlements interact with systems of education governance. So we looked at not only the politics, but also what that meant for education policy and provision. And I should give you a definition of political settlements, because we talk about these a lot in this book. Roughly, a political settlement, when I talk about it, it means how political power is distributed in that country and what elites have to do to maintain their hold on power. So if political power is very dominated by a single party, you can expect one kind of policy outcome, depending on how that interacts with the features of the policy domain. And if you have very competitive type of political system where elites have to work really hard to hold on to power, then you have a very different kind of system. This framework describes how we thought about this. So it is the combination of political power and how that's distributed and what elites have to do to hold on to power, and the policy domain, in this case, the education policy. And this is shaped by policies that have been put in place in the past, including the legacy of policies to widen access to get more children into school, and the ideas that political elites and policy elites have about why education is important and how it should be delivered. These two interact to produce the effects of elite commitment and state capacity, really, to deliver learning. So these combination of factors, we think, are the things that bring about a political commitment to learning. We borrowed from Brian Levy, who I believe will also be lecturing to you about the politics of education, this typology of political settlements. And essentially what we have here, this gives you also our country case studies, which were Rwanda, Cambodia and Uganda, which we classify as among the dominant types of political settlement because power is very concentrated there. But also South Africa, which is a democracy, but which has been dominated by a single party, the ANC, for the last 30 years. And then we have two more competitive cases, which are Bangladesh and Ghana. In both of those, ruling elites, in Bangladesh until recently this was true anyway, the ruling elites can be overturned through an election at any time, so we call them competitive. So we don't expect the elites of Bangladesh and Ghana to have the kind of long time horizons that we expect elites in Rwanda or Cambodia in particular could have, or South Africa. Those long time horizons are necessary, really, we assume, because it sometimes requires some quite difficult decisions, some difficult reforms for education policies to deliver better learning outcomes. We put in here in this typology also India, although it's not one of our case studies, so that you can see what kinds of countries these are. On the left-hand side, we see we have institutional complexity of a lower level in most of our countries, in Rwanda, Cambodia, Uganda, Bangladesh, and Ghana. The administrative system is quite personalized. There's a lot of bargaining that goes on. In South Africa and India, on the other hand, on the right-hand side of the typology, you have much more formal, institutionalized kinds of bureaucracies where personalities and personal bargains are not part of the system. So this is how we organized, this is how we thought about our countries. Some were more dominant, some were more competitive, some had a more personalized, and some had a more institutionalized type of administrative system to deliver education policy. This graph shows you that, even in our 6 countries, there was quite a lot of convergence in gross enrollment. That means in how many children were attending school of any age. Some of the countries, you see for Uganda, the green graph, there's hardly any data points at all. I think it tells you quite a lot when the country is not even producing data about its enrollment levels. Completion rates tell you a little bit more about the quality of education that children are getting. And here we see, again, quite a lot of variety, but we see Rwanda improving a great deal over the period. We see also Cambodia improving a great deal over the period, quite fast. Countries like Ghana were a little bit more static, and South Africa and Bangladesh as well improved, but gradually. And Uganda, we see primary completion rates are low at the very beginning of the period, 20 years ago, and remain quite low at the end as well. So quality is a real challenge in Uganda. So our research in these 6 countries, we had country case studies, and we looked at politics, the policy domain of education, and what that meant for elite commitment and state capacity to deliver learning, good quality education that means that children attain the levels of education that they're supposed to, according to the system. And what we found really was, quite interestingly, the politics of education. None of them performed very well in terms of learning. None of these systems were particularly delivering particularly good education outcomes. And the political coalitions that existed remained coalitions that were backing wider access, so those children who are still not able to access schooling, which is fine, we still need to widen access for everyone. But they were not focused on the issue of quality. Those coalitions, political support for education was not really focused on the issue of what children were actually learning. And one reason for this is that in all of the countries, really, we see the education system serve a variety of political goals, not just reading and writing and maths and science and so on, but also education systems are places in which people are hired, they give jobs. It can be a way of transmitting national identity. It can make the government visible in rural areas. It can do all sorts of jobs. Education can have all sorts of purposes. I show you on this slide a picture from a reader, like an early childhood alphabet book from Bangladesh, which has Ga, Kha, Ga, and which is the letters of the alphabet. And they use really quite distressing images from the War of Liberation in 1971 to illustrate their points. And this is an example of how the education system is about instilling citizenship and visions of national history and so on into very young people. Part of the socialization process as governments see it. In the more competitive political settlements in Bangladesh and Ghana, we did see some commitment to education reforms that would produce better learning. And we think this is probably because there's a little bit more space in those systems for different ideas to emerge, and for technocrats for people who are technically knowledgeable about these sectors to share their ideas with elites. However, we do see problems with that commitment to learning coming through to the policy implementation. There's a lot of incoherence with policies. They don't all line up from the centre to the schools. Education bureaucrats, administrators at the local level don't have that much capacity. They don't have that much autonomy either. It's not clear what kind of role teacher unions play in shaping these outcomes. There's a lot of literature that suggests teacher unions block learning reforms because they're not in their interests. They don't want to work harder and they don't want to be forced to show up to school. But we don't really see many signs of that in either Bangladesh or Ghana. In Rwanda, Uganda and Cambodia, all of these 3 are political systems that we characterized as dominant forms of power distribution, but also quite personalized state systems. We saw again that in none of those 3 countries did learning really rise very high up the political agenda. In Rwanda, we saw the very, very dominant political system there, dominant political settlement there, meant that elites were putting in place policies that really didn't have much connection to what was going on the ground. For instance, changing the language of instruction from French to English overnight when many teachers didn't even speak English. In Uganda, there was a lot of emphasis on ensuring universal primary education remained fee-free, and that had some downsides because a lot of parental involvement in schools that could have helped raise the standard of learning could have involved parents in holding schools accountable. This sort of activity was not allowed in order for the president of Uganda to maintain his commitment to fee-free schooling. In Cambodia, we did see some signs that learning was rising up the political agenda, partly because elections had put this on the political agenda. Technocrats in Cambodia were very effectively pushing for more investment in learning. And that had something to do with the pressures of the from business for higher skilled workers to compete in the global markets, global value chains, export industries. In South Africa, and again, Brian Levy will almost certainly talk to you more about this, we did see that ideas about the necessity of higher quality education in the post-apartheid period did mean that there was quite a lot of progress on learning. The bureaucracy is higher quality; it's more institutionalized in many of these other countries. But Levy and team, they found that there were some quite distinctively different outcomes in the Eastern Cape of South Africa as compared to the Western Cape. And they thought that politics and bureaucracy together helped to explain why that was the case. So that was at the national level, how elite commitment shaped learning outcomes. But at the subnational level, again, we see quite a lot of variation within countries, within provinces, and even within districts. And it seems quite clear that where there are policies to promote, to advance learning, to raise learning standards in countries, those are not necessarily aligned with what's going on at the local level. Teacher training can be quite poorly managed. Accountability systems, performance management is quite poorly coordinated in many countries. And that's partly because it's just really, really hard to regulate, to police school and teacher management from the centre. It's very hard in all countries to do that, and where countries don't have the capacity at the local level for education ministers to inspect schools and to support teachers, outcomes can be quite poor. We see throughout that local politics and governance really do matter, but it's quite uneven how it matters. Competitive politics and developmental coalitions were most notable in Ghana, where decentralization was really creating space for policymakers and school education providers to come up with different solutions to the problems that they're facing in schools. So we did see that, without any kind of policy reforms that travelled from the centre to the local level, schools and local education systems were coming up with all kinds of fixes to fill the gap when they didn't have enough teachers, or children weren't showing up, or they didn't have the resources to see children or to give them the books and learning instruction materials that they need. So we did see some cases, I think again in particular Ghana was notable, where you would see stakeholders coming together to bring together, to regulate, to oversee what was going on in schools and to support school governance. We did see that actually what happens in individual schools really does matter, and as many studies have shown before, head teacher leadership really does make a difference. There are all kinds of innovative solutions emerging to school financing, and a really critical thing is when parents and the wider community can build quite constructive relationships of accountability with head teachers in the school to make sure that schools can achieve what they have the potential to achieve. So in summary, policy making around education, learning, about learning reforms is politicised and clientelistic. It is based largely on the politics, what elites have to do to survive. In many countries, that means they don't try to upset teachers too much, because teachers can strike. At the same time, we don't see very many signs of teachers and teacher unions having a big influence either way on education reform in the countries that we worked in. We see that the political coalitions that do exist to support education reforms very much remain those that support wider access, more schools, not necessarily better schools. And we do see that the type of political settlement, although we said, actually across the board there were no great signs of learning really rising up the political agenda. But there's some signs that the more competitive political systems did create more space for these reforms to emerge. Elite ideas about what schools are for really do tend to matter. Changing those ideas is one thing that policymakers often try to do. But the legacies of past policies, in particular those policies that try to get children into school en masse, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. The legacies of those policies have endured, and they mean that the quality of education struggles to rise up the agenda as the most important thing. We see in the countries where political settlements are more competitive that there is more effective accountability for education. There's more room for communities to make demands on schools, and for those demands to travel up some way into the administrative system. In conclusion, I wanted to say that policy making around education reforms that are learning oriented is quite politicized, it's quite clientelistic, it's really to serve the groups that political elites consider to be important. And the political coalitions that do exist to support learning reforms, they support really still wider access, reaching all groups of children more than they support improvements in what they learn. It's more schools, not better schools, remains the political agenda in many countries. That said, the type of political settlement did create an all-closed space for quality reforms. We saw this, in Bangladesh and Ghana. There was more space for ideas about learning reforms than there was in, for instance, Rwanda, Uganda. But it was nevertheless quite hard in any of these political settlements for those learning reforms to travel through to the schools. And instead you end up with quite a lot of local level discretion about how schools are in effect run, about how in effect learning reforms get through. The legacies of past policies really do last. They have a lot of impacts on the learning agenda currently, and elite ideas about what matters in education also do endure. They continue to matter, they can shape what gets on the agenda and what gets left off the political agenda. So we had some policy implications from our work. One is that really what is necessary is stronger political coalitions and policy coalitions to demand quality education. A lot of researchers and civil society activists put a lot of emphasis on educational assessments, on information sources as a way of creating demand, if you like, for quality education. But it's not clear that that necessarily succeeds in the absence of kind of political support for better learning outcomes. That demand still remains to be built in many countries. When aid practitioners want to intervene and help raise this issue on the learning agenda, on the reform agenda, to put learning reforms more centrally into education policy, they should probably try to do so in ways that align with the kind of political settlement that there is in those countries. And those are different in dominant political settlements and competitive political settlements. There are local level solutions, and those can be scaled up, and those can also that can help to overcome the misalignment of governance arrangements that exist, where the policies at the centre are doing one thing and policies at the local are doing something else. And it remains the case that most of these systems are still under-resourced. So it's definitely the case that teachers and schools still don't have enough resources in most countries, even though there are systems in which money is not well spent either. The research implications for this, we do agree mostly that better data on learning outcomes, which children are learning where and what they're learning, is important. And we also think that it might be that elites need to, build some of their own commitment to learning. Maybe we proposed in the book a commitment, elite commitment to learning index, but I'm not sure how people feel about that now. But the research priorities for the future really include some multi-level political economy analysis of countries that have achieved higher quality learning outcomes. Would really help, I think, to understand what the factors were that made it possible in some countries and in some regions in some countries for learning outcomes to be better than others. We should probably look into the kinds of reforms that work well in what kinds of contexts. We should definitely understand a bit more about the political sociology of implementation, the relationship between citizens and teachers and schools, parents and teachers and schools, where the power lies in that, to make teachers more accountable, learning more effective, to hold schools accountable for what they're delivering. And finally, something I think is very important and little understood still, the role of civil society in policy coalitions and learning reforms. What do social movements, what do NGOs and community groups, student groups, what role do they have to play in building those policy coalitions, in building stronger political commitment to learning reforms? I think it's something we need to look at in the future.